comrades, let me go to change the PowerPoint first of all. Okay, so this is number 9, and I thought, as I said, I changed my mind from before. I thought we needed to specifically talk about the idea of Republican socialism, which it's kind of it's kind of underpinned everything I've been talking about, but we never specifically addressed aspects of it. So I thought it might be worth, therefore, attempting to address what it means and where it is in the bigger picture of socialism, where it stands. So I've picked out these 6 points. The first one, I'm going to skip my introduction. I'll make it very, so it was only like my first point, the introduction was more or less a summary of what we've been talking about. And in fact, what we've just talked about now, really, it's about the post-war social monarchy, what it means. I will just move on to that. And then I was going to talk a little bit about neoliberalism, which came up last time, then going on to talk about what do we mean by Republican socialism. So we were talking about last time the post-war social monarchy meaning constitutional monarchy. I was saying the icons being Queen, BBC and NHS. So I guess if it's degenerating, these things will all be not working very well as a sign of degeneration. And I got up to the point where the Tories won in England in 2019. And I want to address the question of the Tories in England next time in my summary, because I hardly mention the Tories from the beginning to end of this whole talk. And yet they're obviously very important and they have to fit into this story. We've mainly talked about the Labour Party and aspects of Labour, Labour politics. And so really we're going to have a politics that can challenge the Tories rather than one that's purely internal to the Labour Party. So I think there's a test. We started then talking about COVID-19. We could have a whole set of talks about what we learned from COVID-19. My take, I think, is that we did very badly at the beginning in terms of, so we talked about social merger, in terms of the level of deaths that we had. Then somehow out of the blue, we did this vaccine, the greatest vaccine program in the entire world, according to the Tories. And I'm thinking, well, that seems to disprove the fact we're going down here. We've now just suddenly bowled up and done this, apparently. But I think that's down to science rather than the Tories, science and something else going on. But now we've ended up again, returning to type, in my opinion. They've managed to cock it all up at the very end by, again, having a world-beating death situation and thing. They've just managed to get us back to failing once more, So in a sense, I think COVID would be a case study in the failings of the state, and that's what Dominic Cummings was going on about. I think he's got a bit to say about this, by the way. I'm going to see what he had to say about it, but it's kind of interesting, his angle on that. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit, and it did come up last time because I think Jennifer raised it. So I did think I'd start with just saying a little bit about neoliberalism and democracy. And so that's my sort of first point before going on to talk specifically about Republican socialism. And I had 3 sort of slides on this, mainly diagrams, but my first one is to say here that we've got, in the yellow, we've got our political side. Here's politics, parliamentary democracy, national government, local government. So there's our political system over here in yellow. And then we've got this neoliberal policy coming in, which is talking about freedom. This is Thatcher speaking about, we'll be free. And we're going to have privatization, deregulation, they call it red tape, moving forward, anything that protects people is red tape. Then they talk about anti-monopoly, because the free market doesn't have time for monopoly, which is ironic, of course, because they create more monopolies than anybody else. And then, of course, anti-union. So these are all manifestations of the neoliberal policy that we all know about. And over here on the right-hand side, we've got, under this free market capitalism, we've got greater accumulation of capital. We've got more concentration and centralization of capital, greater monopoly, and we've got this polarization of wealth and poverty. So we all know the effects of neoliberalism. But the left is generally quite good at opposing the economic aspects of neoliberalism and opposing it, but not thinking through, I would argue, the political side of that. What's happened to our democracy as a result of this neoliberal economic policy? And I argue is it's led us into a crisis of democracy. So how do we make what is the story? So what is the story of that then? What is the democratic aspect? And I thought of these points really about so as my next point about neoliberalism and democracy. Neoliberal policy shrinks democracy because it removes any capital from public control. You know, so it's not that we've got a great democracy, by the way. I'm not saying that, but whatever little bit of democracy we've got, you're taking some capital out by privatization out of public control. And then we've got more tax havens, more deregulation. And then the impact of privatization on national and local government, especially local government where it's still going on. And so what happens is commercial secrecy comes in. So instead of having public accountability, so in our local library, you know, that's been turned over from being a publicly run library to being given out to a private company, we can't find out anything about it anymore because it's all commercial secrecy. We don't tell us anything about what the hell they're doing and how they're spending the money. So in a certain sense, neoliberalism shrinks our democracy. That's one side of it. This retreat of democracy, this reduction of public accountability, even in the way that it was. Even if you think of the old nationalized industries, you know, which were havens of bureaucracy, they were sort of accountable to Parliament in various ways. There was an element of accountability, all of which is stripped out once you've privatized them. You know, and then they set up these bodies to regulate them. Of course, they're captured anyway by the companies themselves. So, you know, it's the shrinking of democracy. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that the social crisis that we get from impoverishment, impoverished people and shrinking democracy makes angry people, and hence you get Trump, you get Boris Johnson, you get all these various other authoritarian populists who say, we'll sort it all out. You've been treated very badly, forgetting that their role in all of this, and give us your votes. And away we go. So in a sense, neoliberalism creating this crisis of democracy, creating a shrinking democracy, creating a failed democracy, and then creating the social problems below that people are turning, as I was arguing last day in the crisis, either towards fascism on one side, or they could be turning towards more democracy. That's why we have to come in with democratic arguments against this. We have to point out that neoliberalism is not just economics, it's about our democracy not working any longer. You know, that's the argument. And then my last point on this was I just thought about Chile, because I thought that's a really interesting example. Yeah, and I didn't look into Chile, but I knew it as many of us on the left would remember Chile in the 1970s. There was a popular front, Allende's popular front, that was making social reforms in Chile. I haven't even gone to the dates or anything, so I haven't looked this up. So I'm just saying we will just know this. And of course, the problem that Allende had was he was a constitutional socialist, right? He wasn't a Republican socialist in the way we said. He was loyal to the Chilean constitution. Indeed, when it was under attack, he said he was defending it. You know, and you can see there's some big mistakes came from that. So there was a crisis in Chilean democracy itself in the course of that. And then, of course, we had Pinochet's military coup, and liberal democracy was then extinguished as a result of that. And that's the point when the so-called Chicago boys, as they were called, I suppose they were all boys, I don't know, from the Chicago University, Milton Friedman and all his theorists were brought into Chile for the first experiment in the neoliberal free market. Now, this is like a reversal of what I've just said, because in a sense, they brought neoliberalism into Chile because they crushed the working class first. They didn't bother with democracy. They knew that if introducing neoliberalism would create a massive social opposition from the working class. So if you do away with Chilean democracy, then you've got a free rein to do as you want with unemployment, with deregulation and all of those things. So the Chilean case does show again this link between the politics and economics, between the politics of democracy and the economics of the free market. The two things go together. And what we should be trying to do as Republican socialists is to say to people, opposing neoliberal policies, that's one thing and that's fine. But you've got to oppose it, but in terms of democracy and what it's doing to democracy. Therefore, you have to have a democratic program if we're going to fight neoliberalism. It's not just enough to be against its impact on people, which of course you have to be. Okay. So it's a political economy of neoliberalism and not purely economics, I would say. Right, so I'm going to move on to my next point, which is about Republican socialism. So I thought I ought to try to draw together some thoughts about Republican socialism which hadn't been specifically addressed, because I would like us to be all using this term and saying we're all Republican socialists, but nobody can do that if we're not comfortable with what does it mean anyway, you know. So we have to be thinking about this term and what it means. So I thought I'd take a moment to do that. It's been implicit in a lot of the things we've been talking about, but I thought I would make it explicit. So the first thing that I wanted to say was I did it a little bit like this. So you could say, in the way we talked, the two elements of Republican socialism, I think, is one, we've talked a lot about the idea of a democratic republic, having a very democratic republic, not a presidential republic, by the way, but a one where power comes from below, having a thoroughly, consistently democratic republic, plus this idea of a social republic. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think these two elements form a kind of the kind of program, if you like. We could call it the democratic and social republic, if we like. We could put them together as one, and we could call it the social and democratic. Couldn't we decide which way to put them around, democratic and social, or social and democratic? But they're brought together as one. Now, I was thinking here, in what I'm saying is, I'm talking about Republican socialism in general. I'm talking about it as a universal idea and a program which has to be applied differently in different nations, different states and social formations. So in other words, you could be a Republican socialist in Scotland, or you could be one in France, or you could be one in the UK or in Belarus or whatever, but it would be all different wherever you were. So it's not just to say, oh, Republican socialism, how does this work in Portugal, for example? What would you be saying there, just as a for instance? And it's interesting to me that, and I thought I'd take the example of France, because the French, being already a republic, of course, they're the fifth republic. So can you be a republic in a country can you be a Republican in a country that's already a republic, you know, or is it now redundant? And what's interesting to me is that the French left, since 1968, tended to adopt this slogan of a sixth republic. So they're really saying is, even though we've already got a republic and it's the fifth one, we want a new republic. So you can be a Republican socialist in a country with a republic. Just what you're saying is it's not the right republic. And I do believe that in America, now the crisis in American republicanism, in the American republic, points out to the idea that you could have a Republican socialism in America. There's a different answer to the crisis of democracy in America, which Trumpism has brought to a head. So I'm arguing that, you know, Republican socialism in France is not going to be the same as Republican socialism in Belarus or in the UK. So it has to be adapted to local conditions, but it's universal in the sense that you could apply this in many countries, probably anywhere, I think. So that's my first thing. The second point about it is, so I'll just say, I will add one point on here. I do want to talk about England, but I'm not going to do that today. So I'm still keeping in the generality rather than our specific concrete circumstances. I won't be talking about the Tories, I won't be talking about England and that. And we'll do that in the summary next time, because that's where we need to get to. So the next point is, I thought of, well, let's use the term a broad church. I think Republican socialism is a broad church. Now, the Labour Party is also often called a broad church, and they mean a broad church of liberals and socialists, or a broad church of loyalists and Republicans, you know, kind of contradiction. So I'm not using it in that sense. I'm opposed to the Labour Party broad church, by the way, but I think amongst Republican socialists, Republican socialism, we can think of it as a broad church. There are different approaches to it. We can look to Tony Benn as a social democrat, and we can say that probably he's on the right of Republican socialism, and we could think that Marx and communism was to the left of it. But we're in a united front, I would argue. So Republican socialism is broad enough to take whole strands of opinion on the left, in my opinion, be they communists or social democrats. And obviously when George and Marie do their bit, they will be looking at Marx. They're going to be showing Marx's republicanism, by the way, you know, that why you can see that Marx was a kind of Republican socialist as well. And that's what we're going to be looking at later. So I wanted to put this to say that here we could put, again, I'm just using Marx and Benn because we know something of these people. So my view is that Marx was a Republican socialist and a communist, whereas Tony Benn was a Republican socialist and not a communist. But both of them were internationalists in their way. So I think they're not the same, but Republican socialism is broad enough to have different strands within it, okay, and different opinions. It's not we're not trying to set up a sect, a Republican socialist sect of true believers, right? That's not what we're doing here. I want to see Republican socialism as a broader set of politics that people can take up. Maybe it's a Republican road to international socialism, and I wondered about not socialism in one country. But anyway, that's another sort of argument. So it made me think the next point, just to go on from that, was to say that Republican socialism therefore tends to be more national. What can be done in one nation or state? I say national, but not nationalist. So I don't think it's nationalist, but it is national. So you can speak of Republican socialism in Scotland or Ireland or whatever, you know, it's national in that sense. Although both republicanism and socialism are international concepts. You know, when I talked about republicanism, the brotherhood of man was right from the beginning, that idea of fraternity was about seeing republicanism as a universal, not a purely national phenomenon. On the other hand, one could argue, that communism is about global solutions to global capitalism. You know, there are many global issues that cannot be solved in one country, climate change being one, pollution, poverty, various these other things. So for me, communism, and again, people who disagree with this, communism is more about how do we solve global problems, world problems, that capitalism through multinational corporations and all these things has created a global system too. And these problems can't be solved in one country. If we took climate change, we can't solve climate change in one country. But that doesn't mean to say we can't do something about it in one country. Yes, we certainly could make a difference here. If we had democracy, I would argue, we could certainly make a much bigger difference. So it's trying to get this articulation between what is national and what is kind of global or international, and how they work together in some way. Okay. If you're a Republican socialist and not really a communist, then that's nothing wrong with that. That's just what you want to do is change your society in which you live. You know, but Marx was talking about capitalism as a global phenomenon. Okay, my next point. Okay, so that's the first thing about this articulation of national and international within that, and it being my next point was called the Republican Road. I wanted to argue, as I did all from the beginning, that Republican socialism means the Republican road to socialism. That's a strong part of its case. And I was thinking of some another analogy to take for it, and I came up with, I suppose this one. I came up with Heaven's Gate. So Heaven's Gate. I thought, oh, that's a great idea. Heaven's Gate. Okay. I looked it up, Heaven's Gate. So there was a religious cult in the 1970s called Heaven's Gate. I don't know if anyone remembers it. And there was also a 1980s film called Heaven's Gate that had Chris Christopherson in it, and it was about the Johnson County War in the 1890s. But the cult one was a religious cult that believed in alien spacecraft. That's what they believed in, and that you were going to be rescued. We're going to be rescued by these alien spacecraft coming and taking us away to somewhere a lot better than being on this planet anyway. So they believed in this, and they had a leader, and it was a sect. They went off to some place, I don't know what it was, like some farm or something, whatever. And they did a mass suicide. 38 of them, of his followers, committed suicide. They laid there waiting for the spaceship, which never actually arrived. And so I was thinking of this idea, Heaven's Gate. And I was thinking, well, you know, socialists, we can think of ourselves as preaching socialism. What are we really preaching? In a way, as socialists, we are preaching that there is a place where we could get to, where there wouldn't be poverty, where we could get rid of crime, where there'd be cooperation, where each according to their needs and those things. That is a solution. We don't have to die and go to heaven to find that solution. It can be here. It can be here on this planet. And that's what we as a socialist are kind of doing. We are preaching of a materialist version of a better society. So, but the question was, how do we get there? You know, that's the point. How are we going to get to socialism is the key thing. And the answer is we must go through Heaven's Gate. Okay. So the idea of Heaven's Gate is that the democratic republic, the Republican democracy, the Republican road to socialism, that's Heaven's Gate. And we will never find our way to heaven if we can't find the gate or the key to the lock. So when we stress republicanism, people say, why are you going about republicanism? What about socialism? You know, that's what they'll say to us. Where's the socialism in all of this? Well, you know, we keep going about republicanism. And my answer to that is, this is the way to get there. There's no point in going away how marvelous it will be if we don't have a way of getting there. So we can turn that idea of a Republican road to socialism. If we want to use more Marxist language, we can say it's transitional demands. Republicanism is a program to get us on the road towards the goal that we want. And if we don't have that, then all we can do is make propaganda and say how marvelous it will be without offering anybody a way to get there. So for me, Republican socialism is about finding Heaven's Gate in what we're doing. And that's the message that we have to put over. Otherwise, go, well, what the hell are you going on about all this? Whatever, it's a way to get to. There's no point in telling everything it's marvelous. We can't find a way of getting there. So we're talking about a transitional, in a sense, using some Trotskyist language. I don't mind using all sorts of different languages, about what's called a transition, a program that takes you from where you are today in the direction of where you want to get to. It finds you a route, because otherwise all we're doing is being a protest movement, which is fine because there's a lot of things to protest about, but we're not really getting anywhere. We're not convincing people of how to get from where we are to where we want to be. Now I got then into a little bit. Now the next couple of PowerPoints I didn't quite get right, and before I send them out to you, I will sort of upgrade them slightly. But it was just trying to get this idea of socialism I think needs to be addressed. First thing is to say, and I use the term broad church to remind everybody this is my view, and I'm only one view among a range of views. We've all got different views about this, and I'm not trying to set down the view, right? It's just my opinion, and there'll be different opinions within this broad church. You know, mine's not the same as Ben's, it might not be the same as Marx's, I don't know, and you'd all have other opinions to throw into the pot as well. So the point about the broad church is to say, you know, we let 1,000 flowers bloom within these parameters of Republican socialism. But the one thing I would say was, I don't see socialism as a national system. It's not central planning and state ownership, the Stalinist model that we saw in the Soviet Union. I don't think that's not, in my opinion, what we're trying to get at now in this 21st century. And I take from the Russian Revolution the thing that Trotsky said: there is no socialism anyway in one country, so we can't set up a socialist heaven in one country. Many, many reasons why that's true, but one is that we are so interconnected as a world that we can't go off into some sort of autarky, some isolated place and set up our heaven on our own. So I don't treat socialism, when I use the term, as a kind of state society like the Soviet Union used to be. Capitalism is global, and therefore, obviously, if it's a global system, it can't really be abolished in one country. It can be knocked back, it can be defeated, but it can't really be put out. So I'm not using the word social republic as another term for socialism in one country. I'm not using it because I don't want to say, oh, it's like the Soviet Union, so I'll call it social republic and nobody will spot it. Now, I'm not talking about reinventing the Soviet Union here. What I think a social republic is about, and this is where, again, I want to make some points. A social republic, therefore, is not socialism. It's the steps you can take towards socializing the means of production in one country, with the emphasis on democracy, republican democracy. That's where we're putting our emphasis. The social republic being democracy, full democracy, with social welfare for people, the Commonwealth idea that we're living in a society where people are being put before profit. But what does that mean about capitalism? Well, I think it means a mixed economy, a mix of private and public enterprise. And the question then is, well, how much mix should we have? How much public, how much private? And again, we could have different views on this. Could it be 20% public and 80% private? Could it be 50-50? Could it be 70% public and 30% private? Could it be 90 and 10? And the answer is, I don't know. There will be a mix in our social republic of public and private, but I don't think anybody can say what that would end up being. I think economic analysis and class struggle decides it. Why economic analysis? Because if we're not going to nationalize every fish and chip shop and take the fish and chip shops into public ownership, at least some businesses will remain and continue. They'll still want to do things, and things will be provided by private enterprise, as Lenin did in the new economic policy. So if we knew, well, what percentage of small businesses there were, genuine small businesses in the economy, that would be one guide, as opposed to the giant corporations that are out of control. And then, so we'd have to understand our economy was actually working with detailed analysis of it. And then the class struggle decides, because if capitalists decided in this social republic to shut the factory and leave, what would we do? Well, the workers there would probably go, oh, we're taking that over, so the struggle would decide how much went into public ownership, and it would change, because workers would demand more ownership if all the work was going to be done there. So I think we can't pick a ratio in our mixed economy. The 1945 was something like, I think I said before, 15% public ownership. Either the coal, the gas, the water, electricity, all those other things which were publicly owned. I think it went up to 20%. I haven't checked my figures, but something like that. So it could be much more than that. I wouldn't like to even predict it. But I think one principle that we can say in the social republic is we would need to have commanding heights. As a good term that the militant used to use, the commanding heights. Land and finance would be some key strategic things that a social republic would need to do. It would have to take all the land into public ownership and end this whole nonsense about freehold, leasehold, and all that other stuff. Land is an absolute basic resource. Public ownership of land, and that's about housing. And Jennifer, no doubt, we'll be talking about that with Jennifer sometime in the future. and the banks and the city and finance, which are so important as well. So I think the social republic is not a massive, in this sense, it's not massively different from the kind of program that Jeremy Corbyn was talking about. The only big thing was it's about democracy, the people actually being empowered to do this, as opposed to waiting for Jeremy to become the prime minister and use the crown powers to do it. So it is a big difference, really, because it's about democracy, which we're putting first as the means of getting to this. Okay, so moving on a little bit. Okay, so I was next bit. Is that all right, comrades? I'll keep going. A little bit more, I'm going to say. Okay, ideological struggle. So if we want to argue for Republican socialism, we're going to find ourselves fighting with other socialists over it. You know, maybe not now, because we're in a little corner here talking to people who generally agree. But as soon as we go out into the big bad world, we're going to start meeting some other kind of arguments. So what kind of arguments, and where does Republican socialism stand within the spectrum of socialist opinion? So this was my attempt to try to answer that idea. And so I come up with this diagram, and I'm sort of thinking, here we go. I think we could imagine that, and I put it into the valley of death, you know, road to 600. So cannons to the left of us and cannons to the right of us. So I think Republican socialism with Marx and Ben in there will be having to deal with what I call left reformism. The reformism bit is that you're trying to use the crown, the constitution of the crown in parliament as your instrument for change. So there's Corbyn over there. It's not that he wants reforms and we don't want any reforms. We want reforms. Like I say, it's not the difference about reforms. We want reforms, they want reforms. It's the question of reformism is that how they're using the existing constitution, state and apparatus to get that. That's where the difference is. And then over here, I've got a whole series of things that are left, what I would call left communism. I'm always reminded of Lenin's pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. And that's different from Marx. Marx was a Republican communist, not a left communist. So I think we've got a whole range of other isms in that pot over there. I'm not speculate on it now, so we go there. They're going to be attacking republicanism from the left. So we're going to have people who are following Jeremy Corbyn won't agree with this, and people who are following people more to the left of us. I don't know if that's the Labour Party Marxists. I'm not quite sure who's in that category yet. But we will have to deal with arguments coming from the left of us and arguments coming from the right of us. You know, you'll find if you advocate republicanism, there'll be people to the right saying that's far too extreme, that republicanism. And then you'll have people on the left going, that's really very moderate. It's very, very reformist what you're saying there. You know, so they'll say we're too right wing, and the other will say we're too left wing. But that's what's going to happen. I can absolutely guarantee that that's what'll happen. I can hear Tina right now. Tina is a Republican, but she's slightly over on the left communist side of things. That's what I'd say. You know, so you're talking too much republicanism and not enough socialism. I can hear her saying to me. You know, anyway. That's another story. So that's where we're going to have to, and then the next point is this. I then thought I would think up some ideas of what I would call Republican socialist parties. I want to say that Republican socialism is not my idea, or it's not some new sect thing I've thought up. You can look into history and find they exist. There was James Connolly's Irish Socialist Republican Party. That James Connolly went and stood on the steps of the Dublin post office and declared the Irish Republic. And he said, if we get this republic, well, I better hang on because we need to go on further. So he had a concept of going on from the Irish Republic towards some sort of Irish socialism. So we've got that. And the people in the 1970s in Northern Ireland, by the way, who followed Seamus Costello, they call themselves the Irish Republican Socialist Party. That was the INLA, was their armed wing, and so that was their thing. And Seamus Costello was one of those. Now you've got there. I'm going to talk about the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in a minute. you have the Communist Party of Germany in 1848, whose first demand was Germany should be a republic, one and indivisible. That was the #1 demand that they made. That's a Republican, and that was the party that Marx was involved in. Then you had John Maclean's Scottish Workers' Republican Party. And I would even count Sinn Féin, because Sinn Féin is not a Marxist party, but Sinn Féin, which began as a purely Republican party in the 1970s, when it was merely the voice of the provisional IRA, when it got into the 1980s and became a mass party and built a base in the Catholic working class in Derry and Belfast, okay, it started to adopt not purely Republican nationalism, it started to adopt social programs. It started to talk about the working class and the need for, social, so it became sort of socialistic, really, because it had a genuine base in the working class in Belfast and Derry. I'm contrasting that with the Chartist Party, the first mass party of the working class in this country around about 1848. It's interesting to me because it wasn't quite Republican, it was almost nearly Republican, because what the Chartists demanded was democratic change. They said, without democracy, we're not going to get anywhere. So like Republicanism, they put demands, but not Republican demands, democratic demands as their cutting edge. And they mobilized masses of working class people for the right to vote in 1848. The British Labour Party is not a Republican Socialist party because it voted to keep the monarchy in 1923. And interesting enough, the German Social Democratic Party, founded in 1863, also became a social monarchist party. Engels criticized it for not being Republican, by the way. He said, well, this is a seed of some terrible disaster happening here. Because Engels, remember the Communist Party of Germany in 1848 that made a republic their #1 demand. And he thought that the not having republicanism in the program, the German SDP, was a kind of a sign of corruption and reformism of the worst kind. They'd accepted the Kaiser, they'd gone into a kind of social monarchy kind of approach to politics in a way. No, it was a very big mass party. So here's some parties that we could think of working in this sort of broad framework. Because I'm not saying Sinn Féin is like, like some other parties. I'm not saying it's like the Communist Party or anything like that. I wanted to stop at the Republican Social Democratic Labour Party, the RDLP, because I think that's the best example we have of what I'm talking about. We note it's got the word Russian in it, so that's a good clue. So that means, yes, it is a national party. It was part of the Second International, but it was about Russia. So we could have had British instead of Russian. Then it's got the word Labour Party in it. So that's fine. It's a Russian Labour Party, a bit like the British Labour Party, you might think. Okay, like the British. So there's a kind of, but then it's got the word Social Democratic in it. And what does Social Democratic mean in that context? Well, it had a Republican program. The first demand that the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party made was that Russia should become a democratic republic. And when you look at the program of 1903, 1904, it's a thoroughly democratic Republican program. It talks about the sovereignty of the people. I mean, worth digging that out, and I'll quote it in there. So it's a great example of this broad church. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party wasn't a communist party. It was a broad church, famously had the two wings, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. So it was broad-based. You could have said the Mensheviks were more on the Benite side, and the Bolsheviks were more Marxist, although they were both formerly Marxist factions. And I've reminded myself of the German. We've already discussed the German Social Democratic Party, so forget about that. And we've also discussed the Communist Party of Germany, so we can forget about that. The first demand of the Republic when they visit. So my main point is to say that the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party could be called a historical example of a Republican Socialist Party in the conditions of Tsarism in Russia at that time. I'm nearly coming to the end. So I think I'm going to go through where we're going to go next. Let me just where's that? Here we go. All right, comrades, I think it's the last points I'm now going to make. A couple more slides. Republican socialism, I wanted to think a little bit about the working class in this. Let me just check out my notes a little bit. And I was thinking about the nature of the working class, so I come up with this another diagram. I just can't invent diagrams. Here's another one. And in the Bolshevik, in Lenin's kind of way of talking about it, he and the Marxists that day did talk about the advanced workers. We did the vanguard of the working class. They would use that term, the vanguard. Then there would be like the broad mass of workers, like the average point of view, if you like. And then there would be the backward workers. So you got the vanguard, you got the average, and you got the backward. So he's talking about the different layers of consciousness within the working class. And that's important to understand how they were going to operate, how they were going to function. Now, I'm thinking, I don't like to use vanguard, average, and backward for all sorts of reasons, although that are valid. I started thinking of it, let's talk about that part of the working class acts as organizers. People who are active, the shop stewards. There's a small layer of the working class that's active politically. They go to meetings, they're in the Labour Party, they're activists in the trade union movement. They're not just activists, they're not just members of trade unions, they're shop stewards, they're branch committee members, they're doing stuff, okay? I will call them the organizers. And I don't know what percentage that would be, maybe 1%, a very thin layer of people. Then you've got what I say, organized workers. That's the middle layer who are in trade unions, for example. Maybe we're talking about a few million people, but they're distinct because they're actually in the organizations of the working class. They make up the membership, they go to branch meetings, they're the ones that take the action when there's action to be taken. I don't know how many of them there are. Maybe we're talking a few million people here in that section. And then you probably got in this country the broad mass of unorganized workers who are not in trade unions, who are just individuals really, and they're surviving and doing whatever, but they're kind of outside the working class movement. So, and political consciousness kind of goes a little bit. The organizers are the most politically thinking part of the working class, if you like, the most conscious, politically thought out, part of the working class. Then, but as an individual, of course, you could be unorganized one day, you could join a trade union the next, and then you could become unorganized the day after that. So it's not like for individuals that you're fixed somewhere in that. It's a fluid idea. The question for Corbyn was, to what they always said about Corbyn was, and this wasn't true, but they said it about Corbyn. Well, Corbyn could get a hearing amongst the organisers. He could get this sort of layer of the working class in the Labour Party to support him, but he would never get to the broader mass of workers would never vote for Corbyn. He'd have no chance. And of course, he proved them wrong in the 2017 general election. He was able to he inspired that thin red layer at the top. He inspired those people who then could go out with a message to a much broader part of the working class and win them to the Corbyn programme. Didn't quite succeed, as we know, but disproved people like Tony Blair, who said, hey, Corbyn, nobody will ever listen to Corbyn. He's so far out, he's such a far out lunatic that nobody's going to vote for him. Well, that clearly wasn't true. Because, and one of the reasons why it wasn't true is because he became hegemonic, if you like, amongst the organisers. And so Lenin's argument was the organisers are key. If we can present something to that layer of the working class, they can lead, as it were. They're the people the organisers are the people that can lead this next layer of the working class that can have an impact on the whole of the working class through that channel. So was the Corbyn programme of restoring the social monarchy so bananas that this green section of the working class wouldn't vote for it? Obviously not, because people did, So Corbyn's politics was mass politics. It wasn't the politics of that layer, that fringe. It was mass politics. And so I would argue that to what Tony Benn's politics is mass politics. If we could convince the organizers, that layer amongst the working class, then we could have a much bigger impact upon the broader working class movement. So I don't see, I'm not finishing on this point, I don't see that Republican socialism is a small politics of a narrow sect. It can be the politics, it can become the politics of the working class. And I'll make this one last point, and I think it's important. If you think of this green section, or even the unorganized section, most working class people, and I'll see if you really agree with this, I don't think most of the working class are anti-capitalist. They don't see capitalism necessarily as the enemy. I mean, the people in the red do, but most of the working class people possibly don't. They think maybe capitalism is providing you with a job, it's providing you with money, a salary, employment, the things you need. They probably think, well, we don't like the bad bosses. Well, we'd be good if we had a good boss, so they're probably thinking those ways. So Tony Blair says Corbyn will never do well because the working class will never respond to being anti-capitalist. Now, that's not true, by the way, but that was the kind of message. But that layer of the working class, the green people, as it were, in this side, they do respond. That layer does respond to democracy. So if the working class is not anti-capitalist yet, because if capitalism goes into crisis, everybody's going to wake up with a bang. But if they're not anti-capitalist, they're certainly in favor of democracy. And that's, I think, how the Brexit vote came about. The Tories managed to mobilize democratic arguments and appeal to a broader part of the working class that is very interested in democracy and having rights. Take back control was a democratic slogan, and they got massive support. So I think if the working class is not ready for being totally anti-capitalist at this moment in time, I think that the democratic arguments that we've got can be broadly appealing. And I think so. The very last slide, and we'll finish there, was this one: mass politics. Could Corbyn's social monarchy win mass support? And I argued yes, it could, and it did. Could Ben's social republic win mass support? I believe that it can. Mass opinion on democracy and anti-capitalism, they're two different things amongst the working class, where working people are. And I'll give the example of Brexit, where the Brexit crowd the Tories managed to mobilize the working class around democratic arguments. If you want to get your democracy back, vote for Brexit, they said, and that was a kind of argument that carried some weight. And so my argument, last point, is this: can Republican socialism become mass politics? I believe that it can, because it front loads the question of democracy. It puts democracy to the fore. It points to a way to get from where we are to where we want to be. And on that point, I will now stop and we'll go, there we are, the end, but not quite goodbye. Finish there. And I'm going to stop the sharing as well. And I'm going to take that away. Over to you, Carol.
Wow, that was excellent. I really feel that you, with republicanism, you really are showing us how to do it, how to get through Heaven's Gate, how to. This is a way. Republicanism is a way through to socialism, and I think your presentations have really made more sense to me as an actual way that we can do this than I think any other meetings that I've ever been to. You have a very concrete ideas on how this could all work, which is what we need. We need this vision of how it's going to work if you're going to sell it to people. And the problem with Marx is it's so theoretical. But what you're doing is something much more concrete and far less abstract, which I think is absolutely brilliant. So thank you ever so much, Steve. I really enjoyed that. Any questions? Hands up, everybody. George, right, over to you.
First of all, reformism is a symptom of the fear of the unknown. That's the point I want to make first. Second point, Corbyn got through to a much wider constituency, as you've said, and he got through very much to the youth. Hence his speech at one of the carnivals. I can't remember the name of the carnival, but he spoke at this carnival and he was a tremendous hit. The third point I want to make, and this is what you made towards the end of your address, is the unorganized people. The unorganized constituency has been expressing an activity in working class terms. They've been actually emulating solidarity, working together, organizing, but all this, of course, is informal, entirely informal, but they have got together. We've got a good example where I live, where the women are organizing a strike at a care home, which, by the way, is owned by the largest proprietor of properties in London, Freshwater. But there's also unorganized people in another care home at Allport, also near where I live. So this is a constituency we cannot ignore, not only in Republican arguments, but also in politics in general. I won't keep you any longer. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that, but not now, George. I agree with what you just said, but I'd like to let's take some more points first.
You muted, Carol.
Sorry, oh yes. My mistake. Jennifer, over to you.
One thing you're very good at, Steve, is framing things. Thank you for that talk. It's absolutely magnificent, as Carol says, inspirational, puts it all together and it makes things coherent in a way that they're not otherwise. I just wanted to raise the issue of one of the big problems of capitalism is that it is all short term, and that's why it can't handle big problems. And the great advantage of a Republican framing of things is that it handles the long term and the big problems. And so our only hope of dealing with the climate emergency is to take the long term view. Or, well, it's getting shorter, isn't it? But actually, capitalism, if you like, is the immediate term. And we need something longer term than that. So that was one point. The other point was just to get your views on the role of co-ops in a Republican society.
Thanks very much. That's really, really important. Co-ops, yeah. Paul, your hand is up. Over to you next.
Hi, Steve. Very
Hi,
good.
Paul.
To turn things on its head slightly, I know it's not Republicanism itself, but at the Resist event, there was an attempt by wannabe attendees to talk about proportional representation. Now, ironically, despite the fact that I long favour it, and it's a distraction on the Republican point of view, I'm now starting to waver on the whole issue, mainly because I don't want to work with soft liberals and greenies who are not really that left wing when it comes to stuff. And on your last slide, I think it was the last one, you talked about how Corbyn managed to appear to the mass electorate, as it were, or a large section of it. And it occurred to me, in 2017, both the two main parties got 80% of the electorate, you know, for the two main parties.
Oh,
and it also produced a hung parliament.
Yes.
So, in your view, or perhaps anyone else that wants to answer, does that not blow the argument for proportional representation out of the water?
Can I, just before you go, Paul, I mean, can you specify? I don't quite totally know what you mean by that. Do you mean it kills the argument or it makes the argument?
I'm saying blowing it out of the water, I mean basically killing it.
Killing it. That's what I wanted to understand. Does it kill the
argument? From a left-wing Republican perspective, given that election result, does that actually kill the argument for proportional representation? I realise it's not quite on the Republican issue, but you mentioned the mass appeal of Corbyn, and that's what led me to that question, basically. Sure. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul. Steve, do you want to come back?
I'll come back on. I agree with essentially what George was saying, and I think I was trying to say that if we're going to think about the working class, then we do need to think of these different layers or levels, but not in a hierarchy. I mean, the way I've drawn my diagram, you got one lot at the top, the vanguard, then you got the bit in the middle, and then you got the people down the bottom. But the real point about it is, in a form of struggle, the unorganized workers, who are most oppressed by the system, often they can become the vanguard themselves. You know what I mean? There are times when people will just simply go and do something that's completely. So we mustn't sort of think that we're in some sort of hierarchy, rigid hierarchy. Both individuals can move between those different things. You know, you can be an organizer in a trade, you know, you can be a shop steward, and then you can just become an ordinary member or drop out altogether. So as individuals, we move all over the place. So we're talking about broad numbers of people. We're talking about a layer of people. Maybe that 1% I said at the beginning, maybe that's 100,000 people. It's quite a lot of people. I don't know how many. We could try and estimate what it really was. So you're quite right. The unorganized, by the way, aren't just sitting there doing nothing. So we mustn't look down upon them or say they're backward in that sense. They're probably doing all sorts of things, getting organized in the way that George, and I was thinking about, for example, things like food banks, which maybe have not come through the labor movement, have not come from maybe the shop stewards and activists. They're just people just getting out there and doing stuff, and getting organized, creating new organizations out of nothing, you know, in response to the crisis. So I'm not trying to set up an elitist model, you know, like these the vanguard, these the average, but because people can revolt and change things, you know, from the unorganized. So Lenin's argues, don't ignore the unorganized workers. Obviously, if there are 10 of us around here watching this, we can't really speak to the millions of unorganized workers. You need a mass party to do that. That's why you need a party, you know, so you can get beyond even those people to address the issues of those other people. George, I think, is also right. It's interesting if you. When he talked about youth, I think there was two constituencies. I think there for Corbyn, there was one, people of my age, people who've been through the working class movement, older people generally who've been through the 70s, 80s, Thatcher, the poll tax movement, and all those other things. I count myself in that group, who were completely fringe, and then Corbyn suddenly drew us all back into politics again, and people came and joined the Labour. So that group. But then Corbyn appealed, as George said, to the youth. Now, for us, the social monarchy, restoring the social monarchy is a bit of nostalgia for the past, but for young people who brought up under Thatcher's neoliberal model, the social monarchy, even though they didn't call it that, you know, a bit of socialism or whatever you want to call it, was quite revolutionary for young people. And they were enthusiastic for different sets of reasons than people like me would have been inspired by that. You know what I mean? So the young people thought that. So those young people that were inspired by Corbyn could become Republicans. You know, they could see that as an answer. They could see democracy. They could have gone on from that to somewhere else, because they must be wondering what to do now that Corbyn's gone. You know, that layer of people is still out there. Young people who value democracy, want a more radical democratic. There's lots of young people who aren't Republicans who would be in any mass Republican organization, which I believe the Labour Party could become at some point. Jennifer, I'm just trying to think. One thing I did remember Jennifer saying, and I'm not sure if I missed the other. I think there was 2 points she made, but I've just looked at my notes. One is about cooperatives. I do think, yeah, cooperatives would be definitely part of a social republic, because we're talking about the democracy, not necessarily abolishing private capitalism. That's what I'm saying. We're not. I see it as a mixed economy, but in that mixed economy, you could have private cooperatives. In other words, people setting up cooperatives and organizing them democratically, because that's what a cooperative is a kind of democratic organization. And then you could have private companies with a degree of workers' control. If you had strong trade unions in our social monarchy, which you would have, there would be an element of shop steward influence over even private companies. So the point about the democracy is that we're spreading democracy throughout the whole economy as much as we can, and the more we do that, the more probably it just falls into public ownership, probably eventually at some point, you know. But the point is, what cooperatives, and I'm in favor of cooperatives, show that working people can organize themselves democratically and can do things, can manage their own enterprises and make a jolly good show out of it. They don't need private owners. They don't need, you know, people taking their profits and dividends and all this in order to make the economy run. So, you know, I'm a big supporter. I think cooperatives are part of a program of the social republic. I mean, that's the way. Can you remind me, Jennifer, what the other one was? I can't remember what the other. It was something to do with democracy. I haven't quite noted it down. What was the other thing? Did you have another point?
It was about the advantages of republicanism over capitalism, in that republicanism allows for a long-term view, whereas capitalism is entirely short-term.
Short-term, exactly.
And that's why it can't cope with the big issues of the day.
Yes, I agree with that. Absolutely agree with that. It's that, and we're trying to solve short-term problems in the system that won't allow us to do that. We've been hit with short-termism because the people have got no control over anything. We can't. You know, our version of climate change would be the more democracy, the more democracy we had in the UK. If we had a Republican system of democracy, we would do much more to climate change than any other messing around that they're doing and pretending they're doing this and pretending they're doing something else, and basic policy of doing too little too late all the time. You know, it doesn't matter what it is, they're doing too little of it and then it's always too late, you know. And you're quite right that they're short term as well. So I agree with you on that point. And then I want to go over to Paul and the question of PR, the vexed question of PR. So I go back to the crisis of democracy, Paul. So I'm saying that in this crisis of democracy that we've got, as our system is degenerating, one side of it is a kind of authoritarian populism. It's going down that road where the Tories are taking us dangerously, and taking us to fascism. The other side is towards more democracy. That's the other answer to it. Either authoritarianism, that say we won't have this messing around with democracy anymore. We'll sort this mess out by being dictators. You know, like Hitler was going to make, or Mussolini was going to make the trains run on time. You know, that the more chaotic the system is, the more people think Mussolini would be a great idea. You know, you could sort everything out. So the other side of those people are going towards more democracy. Now, there is a rise of support in PR. And I saw that, I think it was Unite passed a resolution at its conference in favor of PR for the first time. So there's a growing support. And I think, I don't know what the Labour Party conference did. They may have even passed a resolution. I'm not sure. But that to me is a manifestation of this rising interest in democracy. And PR is the focal point for it. PR seems to be it. Now, we don't want to discourage people getting interested in trying to find their route towards democracy. So we're not going to go along and say, you lot are wasting your time. That's not how we should do it. What we should do, though, I say, you've not really thought this through. It's okay, PR, but the only way to get PR is to have a republic, have to do it all properly. Don't do it bit by piecemeal, bit by bit. You'll be going around in circles under this system. So what we have to do is to make the case for make our arguments even more democratic. You know, that's it. They've gone, it's an awakening. To me, it's an awakening of a democratic consciousness and people trying to find a democratic answer to the problem that we're in. And somebody thinks PR, that's the answer. There we go, we got the answer. But it isn't the answer. But it's not that, I think if we had a proper democratic system, we would elect by proportional representation and not by first past the post. So it's a tricky point then, Paul, I'm saying. What would have happened? I don't know, that there was another point about 2017, which I'll allow you to come back on that because I can't quite totally remember what it was. So, you know, Tina was
I'm saying that because in 2017 the majority of the electorate, 80% voted for the two main parties.
Yes.
I'm saying because it meant that there would clear blue water, in my view, as to what the two main parties were offering, and basically I suppose I was arguing. I suppose is the argument for proportional representation kind of distracting, even from a parliamentary point of view. Because we've noticed since the 60s, or even before them possibly, that more and more people started voting for smaller parties. And that's one of the arguments that was used in favour of PR.
Yeah. And
then I look at 2017, and I can see why some on the left are arguing, actually, no, we don't want that. We just need a programme of, of socialist reform and get people to vote on that basis rather than tinkering around with the electoral system. Because that was really why I asked that question.
Yeah, okay. First past the post is an absolutely key element of the way in which the Crown controls Parliament. So once you've only got two parties that people can choose between, it could be Whigs and Tories, it could be Conservatives and Liberals, it could be Labour and Tories. The two-party system allows the party that wins to keep control of Parliament and the Crown to keep control of Parliament. It's an essential part of our system. And if the system is breaking down, like it began to do as soon as Scotland wasn't meant to have a parliament, Wales wasn't meant to have a parliament. As soon as we started doing that, then the whole centralised bureaucratic system starting to break under its own contradictions. So I think the demand for PR is just the dissatisfaction of whole sections of the population, millions of people who think their votes are all wasted. They don't count. And if you're in, a Tory constituency, what's the point in voting? Because it's already decided before you get. So millions of people are disenfranchised. The election's decided by about, I don't know, it's about 50,000 people who twist one way or the other, and that decides the election. And then you get the most bizarre results, and you get, Thatcher getting a majority and then having a 100-seat majority. And the whole thing, to me, is the whole thing's barking mad. So I'm not in favour of first past the post. I don't think it delivers anything. It did deliver a hung parliament in 2017, but the thing about 2017 was it's the first Brexit election. So people were already starting to try to work their way out of the Brexit mess. Corbyn did well because he offered a moderate version of Brexit when Theresa May was arguing a hard version. And therefore, a lot of Remain, this is my opinion, but a lot of Remain supporters then piled in behind Jeremy Corbyn, as well as he still kept his own base as well and his own Labour supporters as well. That combination of things did let Jeremy Corbyn do very well. And it didn't survive 2 more years because of the way the Tories then twisted the whole thing round. So I think that was 2017 was the first Brexit election. And then 2019 was the Brexit suicide or whatever it was that happened then. So I think it's not a normal, 2007 wasn't a normal election. It's part of the crisis of democracy when you're having one government following another one. Cameron going, then May's coming, then Johnson's coming, and it's one, that's it's a peculiar system in crisis.
Paul has got his hand up again. Paul?
Just to come back on what happened at Labour Party conference with regard to proportional representation. The CLP, the ordinary members section, they voted for it by a majority, but the union section, the affiliate section, they put the boot in, which meant that, and because they had more voting power, it didn't go through. But the majority of grassroots members did actually vote for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of 2017 being a Brexit election, I know that's what Theresa May wanted, but I don't believe that was the way it turned out. Once we got our money, once somebody accidentally on purpose leaked the Labour manifesto, things started to turn around then, and the polls started to close. And I think at that point, it was assumed that Labour were going to respect the result of the referendum, as it were. So I don't necessarily agree that 2017, from Labour perspective, was a Brexit election. 2019 clearly was, but I don't believe that was the case with 2017.
I mean, I wouldn't have put anything down to one issue. No election decided on one issue, so I wouldn't like to be too dogmatic on that. So there was a whole range of things, but I think Brexit was still, in 2017, was still a big thing that was trying to get sorted out. I mean, Theresa May wasn't very impressive, and Jeremy Corbyn performed very well, I think, in that election. And there was a lot of people supported his programme and wanted his programme. But I still think in our particular system, the fact that Remain voters came on board with Corbyn because they thought we're either going to have the hard Theresa May Brexit or we can have this more moderate Corbyn kind of resistancy things. They enabled him to do well when nobody thought he was going to do well. So you're right, Paul, it wasn't a one issue thing, but Brexit was one factor, let's put it like that, I'd say. So I'll modify my first answer with what you just said. All right. And that's a good note to finish on, I'd like to
Absolutely.
think.
I was just about to say, Steve, it's now 6 minutes past 9. So
past my bedtime.
Definitely. So thanks very much indeed. And been another amazing talk, and so many people here in this group have such amazing knowledge as well. So it's been a really, really great evening. So thank you very much, Steve, and thank you everybody else for your contributions. They've been really excellent once again.